The dropship cut through the pale blue clouds of Glacieron 6, its hull creaking from the violent temperature shifts as it entered the planet's upper atmosphere. Frost crawled across the viewports like living veins, and the engines groaned in protest as the temperature gauge dipped lower than any of the cadets had ever seen before. When the craft finally touched down on the glacier's surface, it was as if it had landed on a mirror that stretched into eternity. The world outside shimmered under an anemic sun, a wasteland of white dunes, glacial ridges, and frozen mist that refused to move even in the wind. The moment the hatch opened, the cold struck like a living thing. It clawed at every seam of the cadets' suits, forcing itself into their bones, robbing them of breath and thought. Even the mechanical joints in their exosuits stiffened as crystals formed around them. Some cadets stumbled as they stepped onto the icy ground, their boots screeching on the frozen crust. The group consisted of 11 cadets from 7 different species, each shaped by worlds warmer, softer, or simply more forgiving than this one. The wind howled across the plain, dragging along whips of snow like ghostly ribbons. For the first few minutes, no one spoke. The sound of the blizzard drowned out every thought. The ship's engines cut off, and with that, a terrifying silence settled in, a silence so complete that it felt like the planet itself was holding its breath. The cadets' helmets displayed the temperature reading, 60 degrees and dropping. The message from command still echoed in their headsets. Survive for 7 cycles. Shelter, food, heat. Find or build them yourself. Then the communication link went dead. Eli Moran, the only human among them, stood near the rear of the group, his visor fogged from the sudden contrast of his breath and the cold air. His gloved hand wiped it away as he stared into the endless expanse ahead. His body trembled, but not just from the temperature. There was awe there too, a deep, primal kind of respect for the alien beauty that surrounded him. The light was strange here. The sun was distant and small, and what little warmth it gave reflected off the surface, making the world glow in shades of blue and white. Ice cliffs rose like frozen waves, their peaks carved by eons of wind. It was a landscape meant to repel life, not welcome it. Within the first hour, the cadets tried to set up camp. The alien commander of the group, a tall, furred being named Ka-Ren, gave orders through the comm link, his voice shivering with static. His species came from a tundra world, but even his thick coat could not fight this kind of cold. He ordered everyone to activate their portable thermal shields and to gather in a semicircle to conserve energy. The shields emitted a faint amber glow, but their coverage was weak. The wind cut through the field like knives, and the snow piled over their feet faster than they could clear it. The cold did not simply freeze. It invaded, it claimed, it consumed. By the time the first cycle's light faded, several cadets were already struggling. A reptilian cadet's scales had begun to crack under the cold. Another, a bird-like creature, huddled close to the heat source, her feathers coated in frost. Even Ka-Ren's fur had turned stiff with ice. Eli watched them all, kneeling beside his own pack, his hands hovering near the controls of his thermal shield. He knew the shield would only last another 10 hours before the power cells ran dry. That was barely enough for one night. He remembered the briefing. Glacieron 6 had no breathable atmosphere without filtration and no native vegetation. Everything they needed had to come from ingenuity, not abundance. When night fell, the temperature plummeted even lower. The stars appeared like frozen shards of glass, piercing through a sky so dark it seemed to swallow sound. The cadets gathered closer, forming tight clusters around the single fusion stove that hummed weakly in the center of the camp. The faint flame inside looked like a dying heart, its light flickering against desperate faces. Conversation was nearly impossible. Most spoke only to curse the cold or whisper prayers in their own languages. One alien's breathing became irregular. His species was not built for sub-zero endurance. Eli helped him adjust the respirator tube, tightening the seal and adding an extra layer of fabric from his kit. The alien's 4 eyes blinked in gratitude, but no words came. Eli sat back on his heels and looked around. The camp looked pitiful, nothing but flimsy blankets held by rods, a few metallic crates, and tired bodies huddled together for warmth. The snow reflected their faint lights, creating the illusion of safety, but it was an illusion only. He exhaled, watching his breath crystallize in front of his visor. He had trained for endurance on Mars, fought through the endless storms of red dust, but this was different. The cold here was intelligent. It searched for weaknesses, seeped into every corner of thought. He closed his eyes and imagined the warmth of Earth sunlight, the smell of soil, the comfort of a fireplace. The images hurt, like memories of something extinct. Hours dragged on. A few cadets drifted into shallow sleep, their bodies twitching as their systems tried to conserve energy. Eli stayed awake. He listened to the wind pressing against the shields, the sound like 1,000 hands scraping at the walls. He knew this camp would not survive another cycle. The shields would fail, and once the power was gone, the temperature would drop fast enough to stop hearts in minutes. He turned his helmet light toward the horizon, watching the snow swirl in patterns that almost looked like waves. Then, somewhere deep inside him, a memory surfaced of an old survival book his grandfather once showed him. Snow is not the enemy. Snow is insulation. Snow holds warmth. He stared at the thick crust beneath his boots, struck by the idea. The others were using their heat against the environment, but what if he used the environment itself as a shield? He crouched and brushed the top layer of frost aside, revealing the denser snow beneath, tightly packed, almost solid. His gloved fingers pressed against it, feeling the resistance. It could hold weight. It could be shaped. He stood up, scanning the surroundings. The wind had carved the terrain into gentle ridges, natural barriers he could use. He looked back at the huddled cadets, then at the gleaming expanse. His mind began to move quickly now, as if something ancient had awakened. He turned on his helmet recorder and whispered notes to himself. Measurements, material density, temperature thresholds. He began testing with his multi-tool, cutting a clean block from the snow. The edges shimmered under his light. The block held firm. He stacked it onto another and noticed how the two pieces fused slightly where the moisture refroze. The structure strengthened under the pressure of the cold. His heart began to beat faster. It could work. If he could build enough of these, he could create a dome strong enough to trap heat inside. He didn't need technology. He needed geometry, patience, and willpower. He worked quietly at first, not wanting to disturb the others. The sound of his knife slicing through snow mixed with the hiss of wind. Hours passed, and his arms grew heavy, but he kept moving. Each block he carved and placed became a promise, a small rebellion against the lifelessness of this world. A few cadets noticed him but said nothing, too exhausted to care. Karen shook his head and muttered through the calm, calling it human madness. Eli didn't argue. He simply kept working until his light faded and his muscles trembled. When he finally stepped back, the first curve of the structure had formed, a spiral base no taller than his waist, but solid. The cold had welded the blocks together, sealing them tighter than glue. He pressed his hand against it and felt the faintest echo of warmth from his own exertion, trapped inside the hollow he had begun to shape. It wasn't much, but it was proof. He stood in silence for a moment, surrounded by the storm, his breath rasping inside his helmet. Above him, the stars flickered like distant fires. For the first time since landing, he felt something stronger than fear. It was purpose. As the others slept in their failing camp, Eli marked a small spot in the snow where his project would grow. Tomorrow, he thought, he would build it higher. Tomorrow, he would make it big enough for everyone. The wind roared across the plain, and he whispered to himself, as if to defy it. If the cold wants to kill us, it will have to work harder than this. Then he turned off his light, sat beside the half-finished wall, and let the frozen silence of Glacieron 6 wrap around him like a challenge he intended to win. When the dim light of Glacieron 6's second day crept across the horizon, it was not sunrise in any familiar sense. The planet's star hung weak and far, its rays diffused through a thick curtain of ice haze, painting the world in hues of silver and faint blue. The storm had eased, but the cold had grown sharper, crueler. Every sound seemed frozen mid-air, every movement slowed by resistance. The camp stood half-buried, a patch of metallic wreckage and faint orange lights flickering like dying embers in a sea of white. Eli woke before the others, his joints aching from the cold that had seeped through even his insulated suit. His breath misted inside his helmet as he rose and brushed the frost from his visor. The igloo base he had built the previous night still stood, untouched by the storm. The curved wall gleamed faintly under the pale light, resilient, unbroken. Seeing it survive through the blizzard filled him with silent resolve. He checked his wrist display, temperature -67, power level at 32%. The thermal shield readings had dropped dangerously low. Most of the other cadets' units flickered weakly. their batteries nearly drained. He could already see movement inside the huddled camp. Karen was stirring, shaking off a coat of frozen snow. The others moved sluggishly, some coughing through cracked respirator vents. Eli knew he had no time to lose. He retrieved his knife and heat drill, checked the settings, and trudged back to his construction site. The snow crunched beneath his boots, every step echoing in the still air. The cold gnawed at his fingertips, even through his gloves. His breath quickened, fogging the inside of his visor, but he forced his thoughts to stay calm. The idea had been clear in his mind all night. Use the planet's own material against itself? The snow could insulate if shaped properly. Heat, once trapped, could remain contained within a well-sealed dome. It was a paradox. Use the enemy to fight the enemy. He began by cutting new blocks, carving them with slow, deliberate precision. The upper layers were too soft, so he dug deeper, reaching the compressed strata formed by centuries of pressure. These denser layers were ideal, solid, and heavy. Each block weighed nearly as much as his pack, and lifting them tested his strength to the limit. The process became a rhythm. Cut, lift, stack, adjust the curve. He built by instinct, guided by geometry he had seen only in old schematics back on Earth. How arcs distributed weight, how spirals absorbed stress. The cold made his tools sluggish, so he used his own body heat to keep the drill functional, pressing it against his chest between uses. The first layers rose quickly, but as the dome began to curve inward, balance became harder. A few blocks slipped, collapsing small sections, forcing him to start over. He cursed under his breath, but refused to stop. His muscles burned, his back ached, yet the motion kept him warm. From the camp, several cadets noticed his movements. A few wandered closer, their visors glinting in the faint light. Karen was among them, his breath visible through the frost collecting around his snout. He tilted his head, studying the strange spiral of snow that grew with every hour. Through the comm link, his deep voice crackled with disbelief. "Human, what is this madness? The surface kills, not shelters. You waste strength for nothing." Eli didn't look up. His hands were busy adjusting the angle of a new layer. "It's not madness," he answered calmly. "It's insulation. Snow traps air. Air traps heat. If we build it right, we won't freeze tonight." Karen scoffed, the sound like a growl, distorted by static. "You cannot fight the planet. It will crush you." Eli's only reply was the sound of his knife cutting another perfect block. Soon the others drifted back to their shelters, muttering. A few stayed, watching with detached curiosity. One of them, a small avian cadet with pale feathers, tilted her head, seemingly intrigued. She approached slowly and offered to help lift a block. Eli nodded, grateful but cautious. He didn't want to depend on anyone yet. They worked in silence for several minutes, the sound of their breathing the only sign of life in the frozen expanse. Together, they raised the wall higher, the dome beginning to curve into a hemisphere. The igloo's shape became more distinct, a seamless transition of snow blocks locked together in tight arcs. Eli stepped back and scanned his work. The interior space was large enough for two people now. It wasn't perfect, but it was strong. He needed to reinforce the inside before sealing it completely. He remembered that the cold outside could help rather than hinder. The moisture from his breath would freeze along the walls, bonding them like cement. He removed a small reflective sheet from his pack, one meant for emergency distress signals, and attached it to the inner surface of the dome. Then another, and another, until the curved interior shimmered with metallic reflections. The sunlight, faint as it was, would bounce across these surfaces and spread evenly. He had no electricity to waste, but he had light. He smiled faintly, his breath turning to vapor clouds in the chilled air. When he crawled back outside, he saw the cadets struggling to ignite a thermal coil. Sparks fizzled out uselessly against the wind. Their movements were slow and disorganized, exhaustion clear in every gesture. Eli wanted to shout that they could all take shelter soon. That warmth was not impossible, but he knew they wouldn't listen until they saw results. Words meant little here. Only proof mattered. So he kept building. He carved an entrance tunnel next, digging down at an angle before hollowing it toward the base of the igloo. The wind flowed over it instead of inside, reducing heat loss. Every small detail mattered. He lined the floor with compacted snow, smooth enough for crawling, and sealed the outer layer with a coat of frost that hardened immediately. By the third hour, his energy was nearly spent. Sweat clung to his skin beneath the suit, despite the freezing air. His pulse pounded in his ears. He paused, only to drink from his hydration pack, the liquid tasting metallic and half-frozen. The sun had climbed higher, if such a term could even apply to this planet's dim light, and the surface shimmered like crystal glass. The igloo now stood nearly 2 meters tall, its curve closing perfectly at the top. He left a small circular opening, a vent later to become his skylight. The design came naturally, as if his mind reached back through generations to the Arctic explorers of Earth's past, people who had once lived and thrived in worlds not so different from this one. He could almost hear his grandfather's voice again, telling him stories of snow houses glowing with firelight under polar skies. When he finally stepped back, the structure gleamed under the alien sun like a jewel carved from ice. The others had stopped working now, staring at it from a distance. Karen approached again, this time more cautious. "What is this?" he asked, his tone no longer mocking but uncertain. Eli turned toward him, his breath steady despite his exhaustion. "Home," he said simply. He pointed to the small vent. "Once sealed, it will trap heat. Once heated, it will stay that way. The cold will help it hold." Karen looked skeptical, but the idea of warmth was powerful bait. "If it fails, we all die," he said. "If it works," Eli replied, "we live." As the alien commander retreated, Eli entered the igloo and crouched inside. The silence was absolute, different from the silence outside. Here, sound felt contained, almost intimate. He could hear the slow rhythm of his own heartbeat. He ignited a small heater cell near the wall and watched as the temperature on his wrist display rose from -45 to -10 in minutes. The inner surface began to sweat slightly, then froze again, sealing even tighter. The concept worked. The insulation was real. He felt a wave of satisfaction stronger than hunger or fatigue. He sat there for a long time, breathing in the recycled air, studying how the light from the vent above bent through the ice. It scattered into a faint rainbow, painting the reflective walls with soft color. It looked almost beautiful. He imagined expanding it, adding space for others, maybe even making a cooking corner where heat could serve more than survival, something human, something civilized. For now, though, he just closed his eyes and rested his head against the cold wall, listening to the quiet hum of life inside the shell of snow. Outside, the wind howled across the plains, carrying the promise of another night of deathly cold. But inside, for the first time, Eli felt warm. The planet had not beaten him. It had taught him. And as he drifted into half-sleep, he realized that this frozen world had just witnessed the first human home ever built beneath an alien sun of ice. By the time the planet's pale sun reached its highest point, the igloo stood complete, casting a faint blue shadow across the frozen plain. The wind had quieted for now, though the horizon shimmered with the promise of another storm. The other cadets had abandoned their scattered shelters, choosing instead to cluster near the strange white dome that the human had built. None of them wanted to admit it, but curiosity had conquered pride. The structure looked both alien and ancient, like something grown from the planet itself. Eli stood at its entrance, his body heavy with exhaustion, but his eyes still alive with purpose. He motioned for those nearest to come closer. Karen approached first, followed by the avian cadet who had helped him earlier, her feathers dusted with frost. "Come in," Eli said through the comm channel, his voice steady but soft. "It's ready." Inside, the air was colder than breath, but far warmer than the world outside. The dome held sound in a strange way. Each movement echoed softly. Each breath seemed amplified. Eli knelt near the small pit in the center of the floor, where he had arranged several objects scavenged from the cadets' supply crates. Bits of metal, carbon rods, fragments of unused ration heaters, and one compact fusion cell. The cell was weak, half-spent, but it still contained enough energy to sustain warmth for a full night, if used properly. The others watched him curiously as he adjusted the metal framework around it, positioning thin sheets of reflective foil to guide the heat outward but not upward. It was a crude design, primitive, yet functional. "Won't the heat melt the structure?" Karen asked suspiciously, his large shadow stretching across the curved wall. Eli shook his head. "Not if I control it," he said. "The heat will rise, but the snow will freeze again where it touches the wall. It'll make the shell stronger." He spoke while working, his gloved fingers moving quickly, connecting wires and sealing them with a quick burst of his heat tool. When he pressed the activation switch, a soft hum filled the igloo. The air shimmered faintly as warmth began to spread, subtle at first, like a heartbeat beneath the surface. The cadets exchanged glances. The temperature inside began to climb, -20, then -10. Frost that had coated the reflective sheets began to soften, droplets forming before freezing again in delicate patterns. The light filtering from the small skylight above refracted through those thin layers, scattering pale rainbows across the curved walls. The space that had felt claustrophobic moments before now seemed alive. Eli smiled slightly, rubbing his palms together. "There," he murmured, almost to himself. The fire inside the ice. One by one the cadets entered. The difference between the outside and inside was immediate. Their breathing slowed, the shivering stopped, and for the first time since arrival, no one's teeth chattered over the comm channel. Even Karen's harsh expression softened. The avian cadet let out a sound that was half sigh, half chirp, a noise of quiet relief. She knelt near the central pit, stretching her hands toward the gentle glow radiating from the fusion core. "It feels alive," she said quietly. Eli nodded. "It's heat. It means we're still alive." He began to rearrange the supplies around the perimeter, organizing rations, tools, and broken drone parts into sections. The dome had space for at least 6 cadets to sit comfortably if they rotated. He used compact snow blocks to carve small seating platforms and line them with thin insulation sheets. The air was no longer lethal here. It was breathable, calm, almost human. When his wrist display indicated stable interior temperature, he turned toward the small open vent above. A faint stream of steam escaped, illuminated by the weak sunlight that filtered through the skylight. The light fell directly over the center of the room, casting a pale golden circle that slowly shifted with the planet's rotation. It felt symbolic, like a small sun trapped inside the shell of a dead world. Eli's next step was to make the place livable, not just survivable. He unpacked 2 ration containers, mixed melted snow with the contents, and placed the pot over the vent of the fusion core. Steam rose almost instantly. The smell was faint, but unmistakably comforting, a trace of warmth and food. The cadets turned toward it as if drawn by instinct. It had been more than a day since any of them had eaten properly, and the sight of something cooking, even in this frozen wasteland, awakened something deep and familiar. "You built a kitchen," Karen said, his tone caught between disbelief and admiration. Eli chuckled, his breath fogging. "If we're staying alive, we might as well do it right." As the mixture simmered, the atmosphere inside the igloo changed. The sound of boiling liquid replaced the howling silence they had grown used to. A few cadets laughed for the first time since arrival. Quiet, hesitant laughter, like something forgotten. The avian cadet plucked a small feather from her wing and held it near the vent, watching it dance in the rising heat. "It smells strange," she said, her tone light. "It smells like home," Eli replied. After everyone had eaten, fatigue hit them all at once. The warmth was almost intoxicating, wrapping their bodies in soft exhaustion. Eli adjusted the heat settings, ensuring the core would last through the night. The light from the skylight dimmed gradually as the planet's sun sank below the frozen ridges outside, casting the igloo into twilight. The glow of the fusion core provided enough illumination to paint soft shadows on the curved walls. The cadets settled in a circle, silent but content. For the first time, no one spoke of death or retreat. As the others drifted to sleep, Eli remained awake, sitting near the vent, listening to the subtle creaks and groans of the ice above. The dome expanded and contracted with the temperature, breathing like a living creature. He leaned back, his body finally still, and stared at the light from the vent. Snowflakes drifted through it occasionally, melting as they passed into the warmer air. The balance between heat and cold fascinated him, the fragile harmony that allowed this place to exist without collapsing. He took out his field notebook and began to write observations. The air temperature inside stabilized around -2 degrees, comfortable enough with suits partially deactivated. The fusion cell consumed energy slower than expected due to the insulation. The structure reinforced itself naturally as ice refroze along the walls. It wasn't just survival, it was sustainability. He realized that the same design could work on other planets too, anywhere extreme cold ruled. The thought filled him with quiet pride. Humanity had always been known for adaptability, but seeing it manifest here, under an alien sky, felt profound. Hours passed before he noticed Karin stirring. The alien commander shifted slightly, his fur glistening under the dim light. He opened his eyes and studied the human silently for a moment before speaking. "You did this with your hands," he said, voice low and heavy. "No machines, no drones." Eli nodded, not looking up from his notes. "Sometimes the best tools are already around us. We just forget to use them." Karin was quiet for a long time before responding. "You have earned your place here, human. If not for this, we would have frozen in our sleep." The words were simple, but coming from Karin, they meant more than praise. They meant respect. Eli closed his notebook and smiled faintly. "We're not out of danger yet," he said. "The storm's coming again. But this time, we'll be ready." He looked toward the vent, where faint streaks of lightning flashed beyond the clouds. The world outside was already preparing to test them again, but now there was something new, a reason to endure. He stood, adjusted the heat settings one last time, and sealed the entrance flap tight. The igloo hummed softly, filled with steady warmth and quiet breathing. When he finally lay down near the wall, the surface felt cool against his back, not hostile anymore. He watched the patterns of frost shimmer under the light until his eyes grew heavy. As he drifted into sleep, he thought about the irony of it all, that on a planet made entirely of ice, he had built the warmest home he had ever known. And somewhere deep inside the storm that raged beyond, Glacieron 6 seemed to acknowledge his defiance, its winds screaming less like fury now, and more like reluctant respect for the fragile fire glowing within its frozen heart. The first signs of the coming storm appeared hours before it struck. The air outside had turned unnaturally still, and the light filtering through the skylight grew dimmer until even the faint blue hue of Glacieron 6's weak sun disappeared. The horizon vanished behind rolling curtains of frozen mist, and the ground trembled with distant thunder that did not belong to this frozen world. Eli sensed it before the instruments confirmed it. An atmospheric collapse was approaching, one of those planetary tempests capable of erasing entire landscapes. Inside the igloo, the heat core hummed quietly, but the sound could no longer mask the building pressure outside. He stood near the entrance, feeling the subtle vibration under his boots, and knew that the night ahead would be unlike any other. He tightened the seals around the door flap, layering it with blocks of hardened snow and compact ice to keep the wind from piercing through. Karin helped him, his thick claws scraping against the icy surface as he wedged each piece into place. The avian cadet, perched near the central pit, adjusted the fusion cell output, keeping it low enough to conserve energy but high enough to maintain warmth. The other cadets worked in silence, following Eli's gestures rather than questioning them. Outside, the first gusts struck, faint at first but growing with terrifying speed. The dome shuddered under the impact, a deep, resonant sound like the growl of a planet. Eli looked upward, watching the faint cracks of frost appear along the ceiling before sealing themselves again. The structure was holding, flexing under pressure but refusing to break. It was exactly what he had hoped for. He crawled to the central area and checked the temperature monitor. The interior air remained steady at just above freezing, miraculous compared to the deadly cold beyond, but he knew the storm would not stop there. The sensors outside showed wind speeds rising beyond 200 kilometers per hour, with temperature dropping fast enough to freeze exposed machinery in seconds. When the blizzard hit in full, the sound was overwhelming. It was not mere wind. It was the roar of a living force pounding and twisting against the dome, seeking a way inside. The igloo vibrated under the relentless assault, snow cascading down its sides and burying it deeper into the ground. The cadets huddled closer around the heat pit, their eyes wide as flashes of violet lightning flickered through the skylight above. The air shimmered faintly each time the electric surge passed, illuminating their faces in ghostly patterns. Eli sat still among them, his expression calm but focused. He could feel the pressure pushing against the walls, hear the faint moan of shifting ice, but he trusted his creation. He had built it for this moment. Karin crouched near the entrance, watching the snow pile higher until the last trace of light vanished from the vent. "The skylight is gone," he said through the comm, his tone edged with concern. Eli nodded. "Good. The more snow covers us, the better the insulation. The warmth will stay trapped." His confidence steadied the others. The avian cadet adjusted the heat output again, her feathers trembling as she worked. A few of the others began murmuring quietly, sharing low voices that blended with the hum of the storm outside. The igloo had become their world, small, fragile, and alive in the heart of a frozen hurricane. Hours passed, but the blizzard only intensified. The temperature monitors outside went dark one by one, overwhelmed by the storm. Inside, condensation formed along the inner walls and refroze into crystalline ridges that caught the faint glow of the core, turning the dome into a shimmering cave of light. The heat from the central pit mixed with the cold from the ceiling, creating a strange, balanced mist that drifted lazily through the air. It was beautiful in its own eerie way, like the auroras that danced above Earth's poles. The avian cadet sat mesmerized by it, her eyes reflecting the colors. "It's alive," she whispered softly, her voice barely audible. Eli smiled faintly. "Maybe it is," he said. "Maybe the planet just wants to see if we deserve to stay." Suddenly, a deep crack echoed through the ground, followed by a rumbling vibration. One of the cadets gasped. A fissure had opened near the base, letting in a burst of icy air that sent frost racing across the floor. Eli crawled toward it immediately, pulling a block of compact snow from the inner reserve. The cold cut through his gloves, biting into his skin, but he ignored it. He pressed the block into the gap, sealing it with his body heat and the brief pulse of his tool's thermal blade. Steam rose as the snow melted, then refroze instantly. The fissure closed, the dome silent once again, except for the unending scream of the wind outside. He leaned back, breathing heavily. Karin placed a heavy claw on his shoulder. "You are stubborn, human," he said, his voice low but not unkind. "The storm tests us all, but I begin to think it will break before you do." Eli let out a quiet laugh. "That's the plan," he said. "Outlast the planet." He adjusted the heat flow once more, lowering it slightly. The warmth now radiated evenly, filling every corner of the dome. For the first time in many hours, no one spoke. The group sat in silence, listening to the muffled thunder beyond the walls. It was a strange, sacred quiet, an understanding that survival was no longer about endurance, but about unity. Time became impossible to measure. The storm had erased the day-night cycle entirely. Some cadets dozed off where they sat, their helmets resting against the icy wall. The heat core pulsed steadily, its soft orange glow the only rhythm left to mark the hours. Eli stayed awake, his eyes fixed on the ceiling. He thought about how fragile this shelter truly was, an eggshell of ice standing against a force that could crush mountains. Yet, somehow, it held. The thought filled him with a sense of wonder that no textbook or simulator could have ever taught. At one point, a sound unlike the others reached his ears, a low, resonant hum that didn't belong to the wind. He stood slowly, pressing his hand against the wall. The vibration felt different, deeper. He realized it wasn't the storm. It was the glacier itself, shifting under pressure. The ice beneath them was alive, groaning as the frozen plain moved. "Everyone up," he said sharply. The cadets stirred immediately. "If the ground fractures, we need to move fast." They grabbed their packs, eyes alert, hearts pounding. But the quake subsided as quickly as it began, the ice settling back into stillness. The dome hadn't moved an inch. The design had absorbed the tremor perfectly, flexing instead of cracking. Eli exhaled slowly, lowering his hand. "She's still standing," he said under his breath. When the storm finally began to fade, it wasn't obvious at first. The roaring lessened gradually, replaced by the softer sound of wind brushing over snow. The sensors flickered back to life, registering a rise in exterior pressure. Eli moved to the entrance, scraping away the frozen layer that had sealed it shut. A rush of light spilled into the room as he broke through, brilliant and blinding after so many hours of darkness. The others squinted against it, shielding their eyes. Outside, the world had transformed. The storm had sculpted the landscape into smooth, endless waves of ice, erasing every trace of their original camp. Only the igloo remained, half buried but unbroken, its surface glistening like glass. He climbed out and stood on top of it, his boots crunching through the frost. The air was clear now, sharp and silent, with a faint shimmer of light from the horizon where the sun was rising. The others joined him one by one, emerging cautiously into the pale glow. Karen tilted his head back, his fur glittering with frost, and said quietly, "We survived the planet's wrath." Eli looked around at the desolate beauty surrounding them and nodded. "No," he said, We didn't just survive. We proved it can be lived in. The avian cadet extended her wings, catching the cold sunlight, her feathers glowing faintly. Your dome saved us, she said. No, Eli replied, smiling faintly. We saved ourselves. The dome was just a way to remind us what we could do together. He crouched and touched the icy surface of his creation. Beneath the frost, he could still feel the trapped warmth radiating from within, the memory of the fire that had defied the blizzard. As the group stood in silence, the first breeze of calm swept across the plain, carrying with it a whispering sound that almost resembled words. It moved around them like a sigh of relief from the planet itself. The storm had passed, and in its aftermath, the frozen world no longer felt hostile. It felt conquered, not by power, but by ingenuity, endurance, and the fragile, stubborn warmth of a single human who had refused to surrender to the cold. When the storm had passed completely, silence returned to Glacieron 6. It was the kind of silence that felt heavy, not empty, thick with meaning, as if the planet itself were recovering from exhaustion. The wind no longer screamed across the plains. It whispered now, brushing over the icy dunes like a sigh. The light that followed the blizzard was strange and pure. The weak sun hung low over the horizon, casting long streaks of silver across the frozen world. The igloo, half buried beneath snow, glowed faintly in the sunlight, like a monument carved by the storm itself. Eli stood outside for a long time, breathing in the thin, freezing air through his mask, watching steam rise from his own body heat. The cold still bit into his skin, but it no longer felt like an enemy. It felt like part of the world he had finally learned to understand. Around him, the other cadets moved slowly, almost reverently, as if they were stepping through sacred ground. Chiron helped dig out the entrance of the igloo, his thick arms strong and precise. The avian cadet gathered the few supplies that had survived the night, shaking off frost and sorting through the containers. The group was smaller now. 2 had been taken by the cold before the storm began, their forms buried somewhere beyond sight. But those who remained moved with quiet determination. There was no celebration, no loud victory cry. Survival was its own kind of triumph, wordless, solemn, and profound. Eli returned inside the igloo to inspect the interior. The structure was exactly as he had left it. The walls had grown stronger, fused into crystalline layers by the cold. The vent at the top was open again, allowing light to spill through in a narrow column. It illuminated the center like a spotlight, scattering across the reflective foil and creating a soft golden hue that filled the chamber. He knelt near the fusion core, which had dimmed to a faint orange glow, its power nearly spent. He touched its metal casing gently, feeling the lingering warmth against his glove. The device had done its job and more. It had not just kept them alive, it had changed them. Chiron entered behind him, his heavy footsteps muffled by the snow. You should send the signal, he said, his voice low but steady. The trial is over. The instructors will come soon. Eli nodded. The mission drone would have recorded every reading, every fluctuation in heat, every breath they had taken during the storm. The Galactic Academy would see the data and, perhaps for the first time, understand that the human approach to survival was not simply endurance. It was transformation. But he did not rush to send the beacon. Instead, he looked around the small room, his eyes tracing every block, every reflection, every trace of melted ice that had once been frost. This had been more than a shelter. It had been a home. When he finally stepped back outside, the others were already preparing the landing marker. The sky had turned a strange shade of pale lavender, and the faint outline of the retrieval ship shimmered far above, descending slowly through the thin clouds. The cadets gathered near the beacon's light. Some stood in silence. Others exchanged quiet words through their helmets. Chiron approached Eli once more, carrying a small piece of ice carved from the igloo's outer wall. He held it out in his large hand. Take it, he said. You built it. It belongs to you. Eli looked at the fragment. It was clear, polished by the storm, and caught the sunlight like a shard of glass. He smiled faintly and accepted it. It belongs to all of us, he replied. The dome held because everyone believed in it when it mattered. Chiron gave a small nod, something between respect and farewell. As the ship descended, its engines sending faint tremors through the snow, Eli turned to take one last look at the igloo. The entrance was still half buried, but the shape was perfect, a dome of strength and calm in a land of chaos. He imagined future cadets arriving here for new trials, seeing the remnants of his structure still standing against the horizon, a testament to human persistence. Perhaps they would not even know who had built it. Perhaps that was better. Survival was not about glory. It was about leaving something behind that outlasted the fear. When the retrieval team arrived, they recorded the site in silence. One of the drone cameras hovered above the igloo, scanning the design and capturing its structure in three-dimensional detail. The instructor's voice came through the comm line, distorted slightly by interference. "Remarkable," the voice said. "Thermal stability maintained through the worst storm cycle, minimal power consumption, structural resilience beyond projected models. Who designed this?" Karen answered before Eli could speak. "The human," he said simply. "He built it from the ice itself." There was a pause. Then the voice returned, quieter. "Acknowledged." The cadets boarded the transport in an orderly line. As the engines roared to life, Eli took his seat near the viewport. Through the glass, he watched the white expanse fade slowly beneath them. The igloo became a small dot, then a shadow, then nothing but memory. The sunlight reflected off the planet's surface like liquid silver, beautiful and harsh all at once. Karen sat beside him, his gaze fixed forward. After a long silence, he spoke again. "You humans," he said, his tone carrying a trace of something new. Admiration. "You build warmth out of nothing. You find comfort where no life should exist. I think your kind is dangerous, but not in the way we thought." Eli smiled faintly without looking away from the window. "Not dangerous," he said quietly. "Just stubborn." The ship broke through the upper atmosphere, and the pale sky turned dark, filled with stars. Eli leaned back in his seat, exhaustion finally catching up to him. His body ached, his muscles burned, but his mind was still clear. The data from the mission would go to the Academy archives. Engineers would study the dome's thermal structure. The instructors would revise the next trial's parameters. But none of that mattered as much as what he had seen with his own eyes. The moment the cold stopped being a predator and became a teacher, he realized then that survival wasn't about fighting the environment. It was about understanding it, bending to its rhythm until it no longer recognized you as prey. Days later, when the official debriefing took place, Eli stood before a room full of instructors and officers. The holographic projection of the igloo rotated slowly behind him, glowing in faint blue lines. "You didn't just survive," one of the officers said, studying the data. "You altered the environment's relationship to you. That is unprecedented." Eli nodded. "Cold doesn't kill because it hates," he said. "It kills because it doesn't care. You can't fight indifference with strength. You fight it with warmth. You make the world notice you." The room fell silent for a long moment before the lead instructor finally said, "Lesson recorded." When the session ended, Eli walked out of the chamber and into the quiet corridor beyond. Outside the observation window, Glacieron 6 hung like a blue-white pearl in the blackness of space. He stopped to look at it one last time, feeling something that was not pride but peace. That frozen world had tested him, tried to bury him, and in the process, it had shown him who he really was. He had gone there to survive, but he left having learned how to build life out of emptiness. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the small piece of ice Karen had given him. The sunlight from the window hit it, scattering a faint rainbow across his hand. Inside the crystal, he could almost see the reflection of the igloo, the fire inside the ice, the warmth that had defied the storm. He turned it over slowly between his fingers, then smiled and whispered, "Thank you." The glassy fragment shimmered as if in answer. Eli walked away from the window and down the corridor, the echo of his footsteps fading into the quiet hum of the ship. Behind him, the frozen planet turned slowly beneath its distant sun. The storm would come again, as it always did. But somewhere on that endless plain, the dome would stand for years, its walls fused stronger with every freeze and thaw, its heart still faintly warm from the fire one human had lit against the cold. And in that silent monument, Glacieron 6 would remember the cold had driven the cadets to Huddle, but it was the human who taught them how to live.